Hi, welcome to Breaking the Link, Supply Chain Threats, Attacks and Mitigations. My name is Ty Miller. I'm the Managing Director of Threat Intelligence. Threat Intelligence is a specialist security company who focus on security automation, penetration testing, incident response, and pretty much most security services that you would expect. We're the creators of the Evolve Security Automation Cloud, which delivers on-demand specialist security capabilities to augment your security teams through automation. Long-term Black Hat trainer and presenter, so for over a decade, I've been presenting and training with Black Hat, also on the Black Hat Asia Review Board, and also on the Crest ANZ Board of Directors. Basically, what we're going to be talking about today is a few things. So what is actually a supply chain attack? Some of the different supply chain attacks that you can actually experience. Real world supply chain attacks and war stories. So really what we're going to be talking about today is a whole series of different supply chain war stories from different types of attacks so that you can get a really good understanding of the wide array of different types of attacks that you need to be able to be conscious of and also manage from a risk perspective for your organization. There's supply chain, and then we'll also go into supply chain risk management and mitigation techniques. So what we find is that a lot of organizations or individuals, when it comes to supply chain attacks, they sort of throw their hands up and say, there's nothing that you can do about it. But there's some fundamental things that are basically very similar across each of the different supply chain attacks that you can put in mitigation controls and detection controls to be able to contain and detect and manage some of that risk. So we'll go through some of that at the end. So first thing, I'm sure that everyone here knows what a supply chain is, but just to go over those to give you the breadth of the coverage of what a supply chain can look like, is ultimately a supply chain is who your business, other organizations or individuals that your business relies on to actually deliver your business. So there's a whole range of those, but also it's not just the ones that you rely on. There's also third levels of chains, fourth levels of chains, and fifth level. So if you think about your providers who you rely on, they also have providers that they rely on, and they have providers that they rely on to be able to deliver their services. So that is the whole supply chain when you connect it all together. And you can see in the right-hand side in that image that it's a really interconnected sort of chain, and that includes everything from your hardware, your manufacturers and your hardware manufacturers, and that includes things like your IoT devices, your laptops, your servers, hardware being provided to your cloud providers, for example. There's also operating system providers, so things like our Windows operating system, Linux, our mobile operating systems, and who provides those. We're relying on those providers. There's software providers that we actually run, on our servers or on our mobile devices, for example. They all come from individual, vendors or development shops. There's cloud providers that we've become much more reliant on these days. So places like Azure and AWS, as well as any other hosting provider, as well as SaaS providers, which again are becoming more and more popular, and also starting to introduce a pretty significant risk to a lot of businesses because you end up relying on potentially a lot of small to medium businesses as well. And then you've got other third-party providers, which could be vendors, service providers, it could be distributors, it could be, delivery guys for your backup tapes and all of those sort of things. And as I mentioned, there's third-party providers, fourth-party, fifth, sixth, and so on. And ultimately, they create your supply chain. So, what's a supply chain attack? So, ultimately, a lot of the attacks that organizations deal with on a daily basis is direct attacks against their organization. So, they're attacks against your infrastructure, it's attacks against your client side systems, so your employees and your laptops and your software and things like that. Um, but a supply chain attack is different. It performs those attacks, but against your supply chain. So it may be, for example, if you've got your source code repositories sitting in, Atlassian or in GitHub or, a third-party provider, rather than attacking you to get access to, say, your source code, for example, or your data, they go and attack your supply chain. So they break into the third party who you rely on, who actually have access or some sort of trust relationship with you that they can exploit to actually get access to your systems without breaking into you directly. And these are more common than you would think. So, that covers all of those different areas of supply chain. And again, it could be that they're breaking into your third party provider, your fourth party, and so on. So let's basically jump into it and go through some of these war stories and real world examples of some of the supply chain attacks that have happened. So let's start with the manufacturers and hardware. So there's a famous hardware hacker, Joe Grand, and he made a statement once, which was having a well done nation state level hardware implant surface. So in other words, having a state sponsored hardware implant be revealed. That'd be to actually find that would be like witnessing a unicorn jumping over a rainbow. In other words, they are so hard to pick up. And if you have a look at this motherboard here, that's being shown, this was one of the accused hardware implants that was embedded from a company called Elemental Technologies. So AWS was actually looking to acquire Elemental Technologies a number of years ago, and basically they created custom sort of video compression systems, and that was basically for AWS for looking at acquiring that so that they could launch Amazon Prime. And so they actually got their hardware analyzed to try and identify if there are any issues in the hardware. And it actually got revealed that that a tiny microchip that was apparently no bigger than a grain of rice was actually found embedded on these motherboards, which were being developed by Supermicro. And Supermicro is a Chinese manufacturer and one of the biggest manufacturers of motherboards in the world. And they actually manufacture some of these motherboards are actually found in places like Department of Defense, CIA drones, onboard Navy warships, and obviously a lot of commercial organizations that utilize them for video compression. So it just shows you, gives you a real example of how this can actually happen. And when you look at that motherboard getting broken down, it just shows how hard that would actually be to actually pick that up. So if you have a look at the different types of hardware backdoors and how they get implemented, there's one type which is build time backdoors, and that's ultimately at the manufacturer who's creating the motherboard. When you have actually putting the backdoor when they build the motherboard. So that's ultimately a malicious manufacturer at that point, or a compromised manufacturer. So when you look at it, China makes around 75% of mobile hardware and about 90% of PCs. So that puts them in a really unique position globally to be able to actually do build time backdoors. So it's not just China, as we all know. It's just that when China manufactures them, they get a unique position. When you look at places like the US, who aren't, they don't have that sort massive manufacturing capability like China does, they start turning to what's called interdiction, which is sort of like an interception um, technique where Edward Snowden came out and revealed that the preferred technique by the US for hardware implants is actually to intercept hardware in transit, embed the backdoor at that point, and then pass it on to the intended victim. And that's how they would go and backdoor places. So I know that some companies actually avoid passing their hardware through the US so that that sort of stuff doesn't happen. And obviously, it's not just the US who'll do these sort of things. And then there's a number of interesting, I guess, in quotes, features that have been classed as hardware backdoors. Whether they've actually been exploited for that reason or not is another story, but Intel released the Intel Management Engine, and there was a vulnerability in that allowed attackers to actually remotely compromise machines through that and actually modify device drives and those sort of things. Lenovo is a really interesting one where they've come under the gun a number of times for very, very suspicious activity within their devices. So there was one called the Lenovo Superfish, in quotes, malware. And this was where Lenovo basically had software pre-installed on their laptops that would ultimately hook into your web browsers, whether it was Google, Chrome, or Internet Explorer, for example, without the user's permission. And it would actually start injecting third-party advertising into your web browser results, which is obviously not ideal for the users. There was also another one from Lenovo called the Lenovo Service Engine, which was seen as a bootkit. So a bootkit is where the actual backdoor gets embedded not within the operating system itself. It's within your BIOS, basically, that boots your operating system. So the problem with this one was that what it would do is if your Lenovo would come pre-installed with, custom drivers and software and apps and those sort of things, which when you look at the Superfish malware, you probably don't want that sort of stuff on your laptop. Even if you wiped your Windows operating system, when you reinstalled it again, the actual bootkit would reinstall all of the Lenovo software back into your operating system. So you couldn't actually remove it, even if you wiped it from scratch. Then there was the Lenovo Customer Feedback Program spyware. And this was where Lenovo actually put software within the operating systems that they distributed. And that would actually, without permission again, collect analytics about your web browsing data and activities within your operating system and actually send that out to third-party marketing and web analytics sites to be able to track what you're doing. So obviously that's not ideal again, and not what you would expect from when you buy a fresh machine. And then there's Huawei. I don't think I have to go too much into Huawei. I think we all know about that one. So one of the really interesting things, so this is the CTO of one of the sections of Lenovo. And one of the really interesting things, which still makes me laugh when I look at this, is that at his own conference, he sort of cracked it and said, look, I'm sick of getting these questions about and tiptoeing around backdoors in China and in our devices and those sort of things. I'm just going to put it onto the table as to how this actually is. He said, if China asks for backdoors globally, so Lenovo being a Chinese company, if they want backdoors globally, we don't put them in. However, if they want a backdoor in China, then we will put them in. And every multinational in China does the exact same thing. And it's not just China either. He also goes on to say, there's other, basically, if each of the countries, their local laws, they say that they don't have backdoors in them, then we don't put them in. If the local laws say that we do require them in the systems, then they comply with the local laws. And his argument was basically that, if we don't do what China requires, their local laws, then you're basically missing out on the biggest economy on the planet. And that's why they do it. And that's why he says that every other multinational in China does the same thing. So when you look at it from that perspective, it's really interesting. He said it's not just China that's asking us to put backdoors in our systems, it's other countries as well. So that just helps to sort of reveal some of the reality of these things that, quite often get talked about as rumors, but are actually reality and just a part of operating, in these markets. So another part of hardware is IoT devices, and more organizations are getting these within their environments, especially when you start talking about distributed environments, whether it's universities or critical infrastructure providers or even retail, for example. We're getting more and more of these in our networks. And some of these contain both either they're very well known for being insecure, because especially when you're dealing with low-powered devices, but some of them actually contain quite dodgy backdoors in them. So there was some research that was done and revealed that all of these icons, these logos and products that you can see on the screen there, contained a combination of high silicon chips and Xionmai firmware in these CCTV devices. So, funnily enough, try to avoid Huawei. They came back into it. So HiSilicon is actually owned by Huawei. And with these devices, there's a security technique called port knocking. And basically, you can have a system that's completely filtered off from the internet, so it filters itself off. There's no listening ports. But what you can actually do is this thing called port knocking, where if you send a specific combinations of packets to the system, it actually takes that as a bit of a password and instructions. And so these particular devices, if you sent this port knocking over the network, it would actually, on port 5930, it would actually then enable the telnet service and actually have that listening and accessible on the internet. You could then actually log in via the telnet service using a series of hard-coded passwords. So these are as the root user, so you can see the root account and you can see the hard-coded passwords over here that you could just basically send that port knocking, connect to the telnet service, go and log in, and you've got root access to the device, which you can then use as a pivot. You can either obviously control the CCTV system, or you can use that as a pivot point to then access the rest of your internal environment. We've done plenty of penetration tests on, sort of building management systems and red team engagements. And, typically when we get to a CCTV network, you can then escalate privileges out of that. Okay, so that's from a hardware perspective. If we move on to the operating systems, then there was a really interesting one a number of years ago with Juniper, where they actually found backdoor code that had been put into the Juniper firewalls. And so, as you can see, Juniper discovered unauthorized code in the screen OS that could allow a knowledgeable attacker to gain administrative access to the device and also decrypt VPN connections. So there was a couple of backdoors that were put in there. One was to be able to get access to the device, and the other one was a flaw within the encryption algorithms, where they hard-coded sort of one of the seeds for the encryption, which allowed you to then attackers to weaken the encryption and then be able to decrypt them. So that's that was a pretty massive one at the time and concerned a lot of organizations, not just because of their firewalls, but also because it's their remote access system to their entire organization. And that was quite concerning because that gives obviously the remote attackers, and that's remote access to your internal network. Then there's things like Stuxnet. So you may not sort of think about Stuxnet as a supply chain attack, but it actually has a number of supply chain attack features in there, or at different levels of it. So before Stuxnet was launched, the attackers actually broke into J-Micron and Realtek and stole their certificates. They then used those certificates to actually sign user mode and kernel mode rootkit drivers. So drivers are basically within your operating system. They're the fundamental things that typically interact with your hardware. So they're very, very low level. They hook into the kernel of your operating system. And typically, if you try and get a driver on there that's not signed, it'll actually, at best case, warn you and say, do you actually want to have this on there? If it's signed, it's actually deemed as being trusted, and your operating system like Windows will actually just go and install it. So by getting the J-Micron and Realtek certificates, they could actually sign these really low-level drivers, so backdoors, and get them really stealthily into the operating systems without any prompts whatsoever. Once they actually compromised your systems, it would actually check if the system was actually connected to a Siemens PLC or controller controlling a PLC. And if not, it actually then just sat there dormant and remained undetected. And that's how it actually managed to get around and actually get access to its final destination, which was the Iranian nuclear facility, and actually then breach the centrifuges, or destroy some of the centrifuges, I should say. So then some of the other operating systems, like I mentioned, are mobile devices. So Android was found to actually have this Triada pre-installed backdoor that got distributed to a large number of phones that were distributed globally. So what happened with this Triada backdoor is that because Android is, basically a open operating system that, gets distributed to the different hardware mobile phone providers. What happens is that each of the mobile phone manufacturers wants to add their own features into it to try and differentiate them from other mobile phones that have the same Android operating system. So they get custom features developed, and that might be, a better way to log in, better keyboards. It could be, unlocking your phone better through the Face ID. So what they do is actually get third-party development companies to actually develop those features for them. And when they're ready, they actually get the whole image that's going to be on the phone. They give the actual phone image to the third-party provider. They add in the features into the image, and they send back a new image with those new features into it, which then get put onto the phones and distributed globally. So what they found is that they actually sent the image to the third party. They added this Triada backdoor into the phone along with the features that they paid for, and actually sent it back. And that got distributed. That's how it got distributed and embedded through that supply chain attack. That actually affected 42 different models of Android phones that got released globally, which is just really, really scary from that perspective. And one of the reasons why I use a iPhone. So we then have, the famous SolarWinds attack that has happened recently. So we're starting to now we've gone through hardware, we've gone through operating systems, we're now onto software. So SolarWinds is obviously a network management or monitoring tool that keeps track of all of your systems. SolarWinds gets updates from the provider, so SolarWinds update servers, and will automatically update and pull down those updates. So the problem is once you've got software that's actually updating from a third party, from the vendor, if those updates are malicious, it'll automatically download them and install them on your server. And ultimately, that is a requirement of actually, to a degree, of actually, having that software running. If you don't do that, you're starting to do offline updates. That adds a whole operational overhead. And so a lot of the time that doesn't happen, and you just rely on the direct updates from the software provider. So in this case, if we step through what's happened, SolarWinds basically got breached. One of the DLLs within SolarWinds was backdoored. And the next time the update was released, so this DLL here was backdoored. It would be downloaded through to the client's environment. That would then activate the backdoor within your SolarWinds server. The backdoor would then inspect the environment and gather information about the environment. And then it would actually connect to the command and control server that was controlled by the attacker. And this is a really important thing that what I was mentioning about at the start around mitigating and detecting supply chain attacks. It may not be necessarily feasible to a degree to detect that SolarWinds has been breached. It may not be possible to detect that the update is malicious, but you can detect activities like command and control traffic coming out of your SolarWinds system, going to unknown IP addresses or domain names. So typically when you've got these supply chain attacks, they've still got that fundamental same motivation as to what they want to do in the end to a degree. So, in this case, the attacker wants to be able to compromise the target environment and then start running commands inside the environment and escalate their privileges. To be able to do that, the backdoor needs to be able to connect out to the attacker. The attacker then pivots through that server and then starts attacking the internal systems. So all of those, what we call indicators of compromise, can be detected and can be prevented. So, if your SolarWinds system, for example, was created in an isolated environment that couldn't connect out, then, even if you were breached, it gathered the system and it tried to connect back to the command and control system, and that failed because of your security controls. That ultimately mitigates the impact of a supply chain attack. And that's one of the reasons why I was saying that they're not necessarily undetectable, or there's no way that you can manage them. So again, with this case, it would initially connect back to the attacker. They would then issue commands to be executed through the back door. They would then execute it and use a second command and control server that would communicate back to the attacker. So one of the other really interesting things that came out last year from a supply chain attack perspective, especially when you're starting to use things like open source tools, is that GitHub went and did an analysis of all of the vulnerabilities within the software, and to determine, which ones were there for malicious purposes and which ones were not. And their GitHub report that came out claimed that 17% of all vulnerabilities in software were actually planted there for malicious purposes, which is an absolutely phenomenal percentage to be able to claim that they're malicious purposes, those vulnerabilities. Personally, to me, that seems really, really high because of the number of vulnerabilities that we see on a daily basis and we find on a daily basis. A lot of those are definitely not there. They're not, a good portion are not usable or exploitable. The ones, that are critical vulnerabilities, I get that they could potentially be implanted for malicious purposes. So, but that's, when you put that into perspective, and you're relying on things like open source tools, even relying on things like, Linux as an operating system, getting backdoors into kernels. So there was um, a recent article about, some of these developers getting paid to put backdoors into the Linux kernel that actually got caught and banned out of developing for the Linux kernel. And that's come up a number of times in the past where that sort of thing has happened, especially when they're getting funded to actually go and do that for strategic purposes, especially from state-sponsored attackers. But yeah, when you look at the reliance on open source tools and open source software, even SDKs that you use within your tools, that's a really, really massive threat that needs to be managed. So another one from a software perspective was, this is going back a little while now, that OpenBSD many years ago came out where Gregory Perry, who was a former FBI employee, he was obviously covered by an NDA and couldn't talk about things for about 10 years, I think it was. After that expired, he actually came out and announced that the FBI was paying contractors to actually insert backdoors into the OpenBSD IPsec stack, which is basically the encryption stack that's used for VPNs for OpenBSD. And since OpenBSD had the first IPsec stack available that was free, that got integrated into not just open source VPNs, it also got integrated into a lot of commercial VPNs, in some of the firewalls and VPN concentrators back then. So that just again gives you an insight into, some of the fundamental backdoors that are getting put into some of the software from a supply chain attack perspective, because that just gives you absolutely massive amounts of access through a small amount of investment. So then when you move on from even just software, you start looking at some of the more modern things like cloud providers. A lot of organizations are putting a lot of trust in the security of cloud and assuming to a degree that everything that they're using is secure. However, when you have a look at some of the vulnerabilities that have come out, last year, Checkpoint actually discovered two major security flaws in Microsoft Azure. So this was basically where, so Azure let you have the Azure apps, which you can, fire up applications as a PaaS or a SaaS style environment. And you can just go and launch websites. You don't have to look after servers or anything like that, which means that anything underneath your website is controlled and managed by Microsoft or Azure. What Checkpoint found was that you could actually break through the sandbox that's hosting your app and actually break into the underlying Azure infrastructure and get access to the fundamental infrastructure that's running Azure, and therefore gain access to a large number of applications that are being hosted within Azure, and be able to manipulate those and backdoor them and those sort of things. There's other interesting things that have come out with, and I find this specifically around some of the Azure services, is just does my head in around some of the design decisions that they make to actually get some of the features out. So up until recently, and I think this is still only in a preview mode, the current Azure Key Vault, um, you know, is basically there to store secrets and store passwords and encryption keys and certificates and those sort of things. And when you look at it from face value, you say, all right, it's a key vault. It's been designed and implemented by Microsoft in Azure. It must be secure, right? However, when you actually look at the functionality of Key Vault, um, when you look at it from an organization perspective, you might have one solution or one system that might be a database, and it would connect to Key Vault to pull down or connecting to a database, pull down the authentication to be able to connect to a particular database. Right? There might be a web server that needs to get its certificates, for example. So it would connect into Key Vault and get its certificates and set up things like encryption and those sort of things. There might be some encryption and decryption keys for data, maybe in a secure data warehouse or maybe in a bucket, those sort of things. The application connects to Key Vault, pulls that out, gets access to its decryption keys and things. When you look at those in an isolated way, that all seems okay. The problem is when you look at how Key Vault's actually implemented, if you have access to the Key Vault, you have access to everything in the Key Vault. So, that application that's connecting to a database, maybe it's a wiki site, for example, a recipe site or, something, not highly sensitive, and it gets access to its own database. It actually has access to everything in Key Vault. So it could download the decryption keys for data, it can download certificates, it can download clear text passwords out of it. So if that system gets breached, basically all of your authentication and sensitive data gets breached through Key Vault, and then it's basically trivial to then go and escalate your privileges throughout that Azure environment. So that's just another thing that you need to be aware of when you're looking at supply chain attacks, is not necessarily the company getting breached, but also just the implementation of some of the security controls. So thankfully, the preview mode of Key Vault, they've started implementing IAM policies so that you can start restricting what individual systems can actually access within Key Vault, which is great. And that's how it should have been implemented to start with, because a lot of companies we talk to don't actually realize that's how Key Vault works, and didn't realize that their whole environment was exposed if something got breached. Okay. One of the presentations we did, myself and one of my team, Paul Kalinin, we did a Black Hat presentation a few years back called the Active Directory Botnet. And this took advantage of where we basically turned your Active Directory or your domain controllers into a command and control point, and basically used an attack technique where we use, because everything can basically connect to Active Directory at any point, even in globally distributed environments, and the domain controllers are all synced, then a system on one network can actually send messages through your domain controller through the attributes. So it can write attributes and it can read other users' attributes. And that creates a two-way communication channel through your domain controllers. So what that does is ultimately turns your environment into a flat network by communicating through AD. But what actually, from a supply chain perspective, again, when you start introducing cloud and you start having syncing through to your Azure AD, for example, what a lot of people don't realize is that Microsoft exposed this thing called Graph API. And Graph API is an internet accessible API that any one of your users, doesn't have to be privileged, can authenticate to Graph API and start querying things within their permissions. So what we actually did was to be able to interact from the internet with compromised machines on the internal network. through Active Directory, we could actually, from the internet, communicate through Graph API, authenticate with just a single user account, could be a standard user account, and actually then use Graph API to communicate to all of our bots on your internal network, and actually then gain shells through Graph API to the internal network to actually start launching attacks. So, it may seem nice and trivial to have things like, your cloud APIs accessible on the internet. You also have to realize that there's attack vectors that you can use to actually abuse those APIs. And there's probably a lot of functions there that you don't actually realize exist that are introducing risk to your business, like a standard user who's been able to authenticate to your Active Directory from the internet. So when you look at that from the perspective of how many leaked passwords, usernames and passwords that are going out every single week, I only need one of those credentials to work. I can then authenticate to your AD through Graph API. There's also things like, domain takeovers, and they can affect your organization. So obviously, your domain registrars and making sure that your setup in there is secure, but also if those registrars get breached, that can have a major impact on your organization. That's happened numerous times over the years. I remember there were some Google domains that got hijacked as well, but there's also others which are not necessarily the registrar that gets breached, but when you start using places like AWS and Azure that have multi-tenanted SaaS or PaaS solutions, where you're interacting with, say, their CDN, for example, and everyone's domains are getting exposed through the same CDN. If you register a domain and it points to, say, the Azure CDN, and then and that gets set up, and then you remove that, you can actually hijack things like the applications in Azure. So one of our guys actually did some research on Azure, and Microsoft actually uses Azure apps for a bunch of their domains, and they then they point their DNS to it. So all of the different subdomains for their apps, they point those to Azure, and then they go, all right, we've actually finished with this app, and they delete it, right? So maybe it was marketing or something along those lines. And what that means is that the DNS is still pointing to Azure, but the actual app doesn't exist in Azure anymore. And anyone in Azure can then go and register that app. And one of our guys found that he could actually register, or he found that he could register hundreds of Microsoft domains or hijack hundreds of subdomains of Microsoft.com because he could just simply go into Azure and register those apps, which Microsoft already had the DNS entries pointing to. So there again, some of the other flaws that get introduced through these third-party cloud supply chain providers that you really need to be aware of. And he's been working with Microsoft for a long time now to try and get these closed out, but they just have so many and it's so dynamic that they actually still haven't closed out a lot of these domains. So it's not just a problem with Azure as well. That's a big problem with other providers, but it's fundamentally the company's problem who's deleting the apps and not deleting the DNS entries pointing to those. So that's how you can do those domain takeovers. So Amazon is certainly not immune to these either. If you have a look at their bug bounty program, they've had 12 bug bounties paid in the last 9 months, which just gives you a bit of an idea of some of that there are actually problems in there. The details aren't getting released, but there are vulnerabilities in there. I mean, they're complex environments. Of course, they're going to have issues in them. Common implementation issues within AWS include things like OpenS3 buckets, where people put their data up, they don't secure it properly, or they may allow authenticated access to the bucket, and they don't realize that's authenticated access for everyone on Amazon. There's things like insecure IAM policies. Also, when you start setting up policies to allow third-party AWS accounts access to your account, that also inherently can allow any of their supply chain who has access to their account to actually pivot through to your account as well. So just being aware of when you're setting up these policies, making sure that you're not opening up unnecessary access that even third, fourth, and fifth parties can actually pivot through to get access to your data and your systems. Other things is when you allow read-only access in some of these policies, you sort of inherently think, these are read-only for just being able to see, the console, for example, within AWS. But in fact, it's actually read-only access, which means that you can actually read databases and read the data within your databases. So you've got to be really careful strict around what you're actually allowing, and make sure that you know what you're actually allowing within those policies. There's also things like EC2 metadata leakage. So when you build an EC2 server, there's a thing called user data, and that gets stored within metadata within your EC2 instances, and that's how commands to basically build the server. And it's quite common to find things like passwords in there or SSH keys and those sort of things. That if you're on the EC2 box, you can actually extract that out of the metadata from the EC2 box. Amazon have recently implemented restrictions around that so that you can actually prevent users from connecting to the metadata. And then there's actually a problem that we found within Lambda, where when you're using, which internally we called Lambda bleed, and this is where basically if you're making a large number of requests to Lambda, and there's a global parameter that's set, you can actually force it to retrieve other users' data, so get the response of some other user's data within Lambda, and actually get bypass access controls that way. So again, relying completely on your cloud providers from a security perspective is also not a good idea. You really have to be careful around that. So as Docker is becoming more and more prevalent, there's more and more reliance on things like places like Docker Hub, which host the Docker containers and automatically get pulled in when we're launching our Docker containers. It might be through Kubernetes and those sort of things. So Docker Hub had a security breach or a security incident a couple of years back, where this malicious user came and created a Docker Hub account and started publishing malicious Docker containers. So basically they went through, there was about 4 different rounds where they actually submitted different malicious Docker containers, and they were quite popular containers that looked completely safe to use. And people started, subscribing to those, so that the servers within their corporate environment would automatically come and go and pull those Docker containers from Docker Hub. So Docker Hub was actually notified multiple times throughout the year until they were finally had their account, the containers in the account deleted. And that took Docker Hub about a year. So during that period, there was 17 different malicious Docker containers that were published to Docker Hub, and there were 5 million downloads of those malicious Docker containers that got deployed into organizations or onto developers' systems. Basically what happened within those Docker containers, they were running cryptocurrency mining software. So as you started launching your servers to scale out your infrastructure and all of that sort of great stuff, you were also scaling out crypto mining software. And these guys, during that 1 year, pulled in $90,000 of revenue just by distributing those malicious Docker containers through that supply chain attack. So SaaS is another interesting one, which is really challenging the industry. And I think, a lot of the time when people look at this, they see, a SaaS provider and they're they're enabling capability for the organization by connecting their devices from a central point. What I look at when I see this is an unsecured SaaS company sucking data out of your systems that is then susceptible to being hacked. So unfortunately, that's the reality of a lot of SaaS providers. They're typically, and there's a lot of startups coming into the market, and they have been for a number of years now, which means that a lot of these SaaS providers, either are on very tight funding, and therefore they don't have any security teams, they don't have any security budget, and really what they're trying to do is just drive revenue through their business to then build the business, and ultimately they then start looking at security. But unfortunately, it's a second priority to actually building revenue and making a sustainable business. And that's why we see a lot of SaaS providers and a lot of SMBs as well as enterprises getting breached. And you can just have a look at the Evolve platform within our compromised account monitoring service. Over the last 10 years, we've collected over 700 billion leaked passwords from compromised systems around the world that have been leaked. And that's just a phenomenal amount. So we have threat hunters who go out, they find the leaked password dumps, and these are getting added into the platform every week. And that just gives you a bit of an insight into some of the attacks that are going on and the security breaches that are going on. When you have a look since COVID started, we've seen an absolutely phenomenal increase in security breaches to the point where our incident response part of the business has increased 700% due to the amount of security breaches that are happening. And I know that other companies are experiencing the same sort of thing. Basically, we've been doing back-to-back incident response engagements since about March last year. And so that just gives you an idea of the number of security breaches that are happening to companies all around the world. And these are very, very malicious attacks as well. If you want more information about that, then please reach out. So then you've got third-party providers. So Target USA had a HVAC vendor, so managing things like their air conditioning and that sort of stuff. They suffered a breach. They then compromised a whole bunch of credit cards and things, and that impacted Target with about $140 million loss. We actually did an investigation for a government contractor where their IT provider had actually been breached. They were used as a pivot point to gain access to the contractor's environment and started putting backdoors around the environment, creating backdoor accounts. And that was assumed to then obviously act as a pivot point into the government. And then you start looking at things like offshoring and outsourcing your IT. And this is a interesting concept where you try to cut down your business costs and scale out your workforce in a feasible way, but you're giving remote access to your supply chain, to your internal corporate systems. So one of our former CTOs, we presented at DEF CON of his creation of what he called through class transfer. And this is basically proving the point for even if you have 10 or 20 different levels of security for these guys to get through to your servers, to be able to manage those or access your data. He created this thing to transfer data through your screen. So you can see in this video here, I'll just play that. Basically, what it's doing here is he's got QR codes that are going to flash up on the screen. Ultimately, that's the data being transmitted in QR codes, so you can see those. He's got an app on his mobile device, which is recording all of those QR codes. And basically, those QR codes are the data of the file that's being transferred through the screen, through all of the security controls. So in this case, he's doing it through YouTube, and saving it onto the actual mobile device through the screen. And that basically bypasses all of your security controls within your outsourced IT. Even if you're going through Citrix, even if you have intrusion detection and prevention systems, you can see in that case that he's successfully actually downloaded a PDF through the QR codes onto his mobile device through his screen. So during his DEF CON, that's a very simple example, but during his DEF CON presentation, he showed that he could actually get 12.1 megabytes a second coming through the screen using better graphics cards, using the full screen, not using QR codes, actually using the fuzz, using different colored fuzz and those sort of things, and believes that with he actually got with a better video card, he could actually get gigabit transfers through his screen through these video cards, which is absolutely phenomenal to get gigabit data exfiltrated. And you need to take that into account when you're looking at your outsourced IT. And I guarantee you your IPS system or your threat detection systems aren't going to pick that up other than the amount of data being exfiltrated from your organization. Okay, so as I mentioned before, there's third-party providers who, there's a large number of those that are getting hacked all the time. So we already really spoke about that, but that's the number one way that companies are being breached is these third-party providers. So your supply chain getting breached, your credentials get leaked online, so on the dark web or on places like Pastebin, for example, and then they just go and grab those credentials and log into your systems, and that's it. That's the number one way that companies get breached, and there's up to 75% of the attacks the Australian government says or breaches actually occur through that avenue. And that's why things like the Evolve compromised account monitoring are really, really important to stay on top of those things. Okay, so let's have a look at the supply chain risk management. So the first thing you need to do is categorize how the third party fits into your supply chain. So are they a hardware manufacturer? Are they a software manufacturer? Are they, a cloud provider? And then identify what the abuse cases are that exist for that particular supply chain category. So for example, with, the SolarWinds example, they're a software provider. What are the supply chain attacks? So if they get breached, they could distribute malicious backdoors through to our systems, and they could then be used to attack our internal network. That system can then also obviously connect out to the internet. What are the impacts of that part of the supply chain being affected? So let's again say for the SolarWinds example, your SolarWinds server gets breached. Typically by design, your SolarWinds server has a large amount of access to your environment. They can actually, in a lot of cases, authenticate to systems to monitor, performance and that sort of thing, and even in some cases manage them, which would lead to a massive breach of your environment. So what's the likely motivation of an attacker to actually trigger that supply chain attack? And that might be, obviously gaining remote access to your internal corporate systems through that avenue. If it was a hardware provider, obviously gaining access by you buying hardware and putting that into your environment. What's the likelihood that that's going to occur via the third party? So someone like SolarWinds, who's a large organization who has, in theory, a lot of security built around this sort of stuff, the likelihood's probably pretty low but however, the actual risk is quite high. So or the impact is quite high. So the risk actually gets adjusted and can actually, even though the likelihood might be low, the impact is so big that you need to actually manage it. When you start looking at, as I mentioned, smaller SaaS providers, the likelihood actually gets increased because of the susceptibility to being breached, which then can lead to the impacts within your organization. So then you start looking at, all right, well, how can this risk be reduced and is it feasible? So as I mentioned with the SolarWinds one, You're not necessarily going to disable the ability to do updates for your SolarWinds server directly from theirs. However, you can do things like put it, if it's such a system that has such large amount of access within your environment, make sure it's in an isolated environment that can only connect outbound to the systems. Make sure that it can't connect out to the internet. Make sure it can't do DNS tunneling or ICMP tunneling and those sort of things, so that even if it does get breached, there's no command channel, so there's no backdoor channel to connect out to the attacker to give them remote access, and that ultimately kills your system. Even though your system technically got breached, it hasn't been used as a pivot point to your organization. And what are the processes that need to be carried out if these are detected? So we start detecting command and control traffic coming out of your SolarWinds. What needs to actually happen to contain that breach and remediate it. So thank you very much. I hope you got a lot out of that and found it enjoyable. It should have given you a good insight into these attacks and the vast range of attacks and actually the reality of these things happening. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out and obviously give us a buzz if you need any assistance with your security. But thanks very much for joining us.